Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian up here on Capitol Hill at the Rayburn House office building for the Aircraft Carrier Industrial Base Coalition Breakfast. And we just heard from the chairman of the Seapower Committee from Virginia's 1st District, Republican Rob Wittman. Sir, thanks very much for taking some time with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you this morning. What an exciting time.
It is. You talked about funding stability in there. And so it looks like Congress is working hard to try to get something done as we speak. You know, everybody's got their fingers crossed. How optimistic are you that we're going to see a funding measure, and what is it going to mean for shipbuilding and for the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps, as well as all the military services, seeing as how you're also not just the chairman of the Seapower Committee, but you're also projection forces?
Sure. I think something does get done. I think it's the right direction we're moving in overall with defense spending. I would like to have seen the number that came out of the authorization and appropriations in the House end up in the Omnibus bill. It's a little less than that, and the number of ships, the way they're counting them, is a little bit different. But still, we're on the upward trend, which is good, especially as it comes to aircraft carriers, advanced procurement for aircraft carriers for Columbia-class submarine, which is extraordinarily important, and making sure we're staying on track with building the necessary ships, the amphibious ships, good direction on amphibious ships there, as well as our surface ships. So I think overall we're moving in the right direction. This has to be a step in a progression to be able to get to 355. But I think this is a good first step. I would like to have seen it a little bit bigger first step, but a good first step.
One of the questions that everybody's asking is, how does the department absorb this much money that's coming at it? There are folks who are saying that there should be special clauses put in to be able to allow the department to spend that money maybe a little bit later. What's your thinking on that, and what's the body as a whole willing, as far as you're concerned politically? You know, how much leash are you guys willing to give the Pentagon on that?
Well, as I read the appropriations bill last night, I saw that they did provide an extension of time for the Pentagon to operationalize these dollars. So it gives them a good window of time to work with suppliers, work with contractors, work with service industries that provide services to the military, to work through these contracts, to make sure you're not trying to push a lot of money out the door. Because remember, it's about the details of these contracts to make sure that the government is getting value for their money, not just a low price, technically acceptable aspect, but making sure we're getting value. So I think those provisions are in there. It's a matter, too, of making sure that the Pentagon executes, that the industry executes, now that we're providing that financial certainty, not only through this year, but 2019. So I think we've laid out things properly to give the flexibility to make sure that we're spending money efficiently and that we truly are getting in these contracts, whether it's construction of systems or provision of services, getting what we need and the biggest bang for our dollar.
One of the things that folks have been talking about for a long time was trying to do multi-ship, multi-year buys of aircraft carriers. Hondo Gertz, the Navy acquisition executive, has actually asked for that, put out an RFP for a 2-ship buy of aircraft carriers. Talk to us about what that means and whether or not Congress is going to give him the authorization that he's seeking in order to be able to do that.
Well, I think that's absolutely critical. We know in ship construction, serial production allows us to bring down costs. So when you can have that predictability with the supplier industrial base, with the shipbuilders, and where they can make the investments in the long term, it brings down the cost. We've seen the projection of cost reduction for buying 2 aircraft carriers of about $2.5 billion. I think that we can get more than that, especially with certainty that's out there. Another important part of that is, I think by doing that and ramping up for Columbia-class production, hopefully we can attract more suppliers into the industrial base. And when we do, there's more competition and we can lower prices even further. You know, today we have about 5,000 suppliers in the industrial base. You know, 20 years ago we had 15,000. So creating that certainty, I think, brings more people back in, helps us reduce cost even more. So I think it's a good thing. On the Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittee, we will put language in this year's NDAA to make certain that this 2-ship buy for aircraft carriers will happen.
Are you satisfied? You know, when you and I last spoke was at the Amphibious Warship Industrial Base Coalition. There's a common theme here, guys. And you were not as happy, I think, with the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan as you would have liked to have been. Are you any more satisfied? Have you and Secretary Spencer and the CNO had conversations about where you'd like that plan to be?
Well, we have further definition on things. I've met recently last week with the CNO and Secretary Spencer about this 30-year shipbuilding plan. There are a lot of, we call it a chiclet chart because there are little squares in there. Some of them are filled in, colored in nicely to say when these ships are going to be built. There's some that are left blank. that Secretary of the Navy and the CNO said we'll build those ships. Congress just needs to fill those in with resources. So we understand our charge. I really think that there are three important elements of certainty and predictability in shipbuilding. First of all is to make sure we have a requirement set that's stable, and I think we have that. We have ships that are mature in design, that are in hot production lines, so we know the cost controls and certainty are there. We want to make sure that Congress provides a financial certainty, which means no CRs, none of these unpredictable elements of doing omnibus spending bills 6 months into a budget year, and then making sure that the industry executes. Those are the three critical elements. So if we provide those things, I think that we'll have what's necessary, not only for amphibious ships, but all across our shipbuilding sectors. The good news is in this year's omnibus budget bill, there are dollars in for LPD Flight 2 or LXR, however you want to term it. So there's more dollars there for amphibious ships, as well as some advanced procurement in that realm. So I think we're doing the right thing to rebuild the Navy's amphibious fleet to assure that they have the capability necessary going forward.
Two quick questions. One, lighter aircraft carriers.
Yes.
One of the obligations that you have, and Senator McCain has made this clear as chairman of the House Senate Armed Services Committee, is that it's your charge to make sure that the Navy builds as the Navy the nation needs for the future.
Yes.
And one of those things was, a whole series of studies, especially including looking at smaller aircraft carriers.
Sure.
From a Huntington Ingalls and from a Navy acquisition standpoint, hey, look, we just spent an awful lot of money on settling on the Ford design. Let's stick to that. The Navy made a very, very good case on, hey, for Kennedy and for Enterprise, let's keep the design frozen and let's not make big changes that'll drive cost. How do you fit in, if you guys decide that you do need a lighter, smaller, maybe non-nuclear aircraft carrier, how's this going to work out, given that the design of such a ship could be $10 billion? So even though the nation may need it, and it may be operationally necessary for having more targets or having more ships out there and more decks, what's your thinking on that, and how would the nation be able to pull it off when there is a concern that you and I have even discussed and other members talk about, that the funding, the big upside funding window may be a relatively brief one?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. We need to look all the time about what our Navy of the future is going to look like. So it's not just smaller aircraft carriers, but it's what is the future attack submarine going to look like? That design needs to start now. What's the future large surface combatant going to look like? What's the replacement for our DDG-51 going to look like? We have to be doing those things now because it takes a while to get those things to production. So all of those things come together. There is a price tag with those. We did put some dollars in this year to begin the design on some of those prospects of future machinations of submarines and surface ships. And we'll always ask the question about what's the right configuration of our aircraft carriers. And remember, too, we have the large deck amphibs that serve as a platform. Now, they have an amphibious element to that also that gives a full strike force capability for our Marine Corps in doing an amphibious forcible entry exercise or attack. So all those things I think are important. So we have to look at where's the crossover there. Is there a crossover with the Marine Corps and their amphibious ships, which are essentially smaller decked aircraft carriers, yet they have an amphibious component to them? Can we assume different roles now that we have the F-35, the F-35B that has a tremendous amount of capability? So I think we have to look not just at the platforms, but the things that we deploy off of those platforms. A lot of talk about, does the 12th aircraft carrier become a platform that has more unmanned systems on it than it does manned systems? So all those things I think we'll be asking in the future to make sure we have the right configuration of ships that are out there. And there's always going to be some crossovers. And the question is going to be, too, how do we best use our resources to have the greatest capability?
Do you think it's fewer bigger or more smaller? Do you have a position or a thinking on that?
Well, I think you have to look at it from a number of ways. We know the future environment's going to be contested. We know we're going to have to fight our way in. We know we're going to have sustainability there. We know whether it's a small aircraft carrier or a large aircraft carrier, we have to be able to sustain operations. Larger aircraft carriers can sustain more sorties, so more ability to be able to fight our way in. Smaller aircraft carriers can do some different things in different scenarios. So what we have to look at is, what are the scenarios we think that are most likely in the future, and what capabilities do we need to make sure we're going to be effective and functional there.
One follow-up before my last question, which is a broader trade question, but there are those who argue that actually figure out how to drive the Ford cost down and actually, instead of building big deck amphibs, build a lot more Ford classes. Is that what you're talking about something that's bigger, has the volume, has the space, has more of that survivability? Is that a little bit of the thinking that you're trying to reflect?
Well, I think that's an important part of it. I don't think in any way, shape, or form, though, that you go away from the large deck amphibs. Remember, the Marine Corps has their mission in being able to independently strike, and especially a forcible entry. That large deck amphib gives them that MAGTAF concept, Marine Air Ground Task Force, to be able to fight in the air and on the ground, to have that support. They've got to be able to go in as a unit. You can't say where we're going to go and we're going to park off the coast waiting for an aircraft carrier to show up. So I think that sustainability there with large deck amphibs is a critical component of what the Marine Corps does to fight. So I don't think that you take that away. I think what you look at is how do those two platforms complement each other, and if there's a fill-in that's needed, what would the fill-in be?
Last question. Trade tensions are rising. The president has imposed 25% steel, 10% aluminum tariffs. That has our European allies furious. There looks, today he's going to sign $50 billion in tariffs on China. And, the United States has benefited from a lot of foreign systems. All of the LCS designs, I suppose with the exception of the Huntington Ingalls national security cutter, are of foreign origin in one way or another, whether it's Navantia, whether it's Fincantieri, whether it's the two LCSs even are foreign designs. How concerned are you that this wave of tariffs that are being imposed is going to negatively potentially impact the nation's ability from a defense standpoint, whether it's on sea power or whether it's on air power, given we're now integrated into a global industrial base with our allies? Joint Strike Fighter can't even exist without our dozen or so international partners.
Well, we have to be mindful of that. The launch tubes for Columbia class are actually machined in Great Britain, so we want to make sure we're mindful of where those component pieces come from. We also understand, too, that the steel that goes into our warships, the aluminum that goes into our warships, the vast majority of that's U.S. produced, and because it has to meet a certain standard, and we want to make sure that we're assured of the production aspects and quality control here in the United States. But another element of that is the systems that are produced elsewhere that do have steel and aluminum component parts of that. If that drives up cost, or if it somehow keeps people out of that particular marketplace, we have to be mindful of that. Another element, too, that doesn't get mentioned in this whole thing is, we have to look at security of the supplier base. So whether it's things like printed circuit boards that do use metals in there, not steel and aluminum per se, and semiconductors, rare earth elements, that's another element of the whole total trade package that we have to look at. What are we doing to assure production capability here in the United States, foundries for semiconductors, plants that produce printed circuit boards, and make sure they're produced here, because if we rely on other nations that aren't necessarily our friends to do those things that are critical components of our defense systems, it, I believe, is a vulnerability. So we have to look at all those things as we talk about trade and where we have secured supplier bases here in the United States for those things. And it may be just component pieces that you acquire on the world marketplace. And yes, it could result in an increase in, let's say, the cabinet that circuitry goes into for an onboard ship system. The cabinet that's built in is made out of steel, so we may see some price increases there. But if it's just that component part of it, it'll be fairly minor as it relates to the total cost of a ship, but still potentially a price increase.
But you're not worried about the potential implications of a trade war on U.S. defense?
Well, it would all depend on what elements of a trade war potentially were to happen. I think before you'd have a full-fledged trade war, you'd have conversations before it got to that particular point, because I think in those situations, all nations lose, and while everybody postures and says they're going to do this and do that, ultimately, do nations actually end up there? We haven't seen major trade wars in a long time because we're so interconnected in the world economy today. The impacts on one nation are not unforeseen if you do these things. So I think there's an interest for the nations to say, yeah, we can do a lot of rhetoric back and forth, but ultimately we have to make sure that this trade gets done.
So you'd say you'd absorb a little bit of cost, not a lot of cost, as chairman of the Seapower Committee.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you could expect a little bit, but I think if you have major costs where you're actually cutting into being able to produce ships, I think that's when you cross the Rubicon that we shouldn't be crossing.
Sir, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Representative Rob Wittman of the 1st District, Republican, Chairman in the Seapower
Thanks.
Projection Forces. Sir, thank you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks again.